We are here to look at James Hollis and a wonderful, book and presentation that he's done called Hauntings, Dispelling the Ghosts Who Run Our Lives, presented by James Hollis. And I am going to be giving the introduction today. My name is Steve Buser. I'm a psychiatrist and co-founder of the Asheville Young Center here in Asheville, North Carolina. And I'll be the host today, and we'll be kind of steering the talk in different directions today. James Hollis is our primary presenter, and you'll be hearing a lot from him today. Len Cruz is one of our panelists. He's here at the Asheville Young Center. We have two folks that may be in our audience today. I didn't get a chance to double check that, but Lionel Corbett and Christina Becker may be helping out and giving some comments today if they're available as well towards the end of today's talk. We want to let you know who is joining us today. We have about 120 people that have signed on, some recorded, some live, and the countries that they come from include Brazil, Canada, Japan, Norway, Slovenia, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and of course the United States. We have two live group sites tonight joining us. One is the Evanston Young Center from Evanston, Illinois, and then our site here, the Asheville Young Center from Asheville, North Carolina. Both groups have a number of people at their site. Evanston Young Center is full, I'm told, so there's quite a few number of people there. And towards the end, if we're able to, once everything's done, we may open up microphones, webcams, and give them a chance to talk with us a little bit too, with feedback and or questions. And please let us know for others out there if you would like to host a live site yourself for any of our upcoming programs. If you have a group of people and would like to connect in a group way, that's a particular nice way of doing so. Today's is a video webinar. It is 90 minutes in duration. People can ask questions from any computer. They can use our chat features, which you can type in a question and send it to us. You can also email questions to info@ashevilleyoungcenter.org. We'll probably have many more questions than we can answer, but we'll do our very best to answer as many of those as possible. And when we get those questions, I'll be reading them to Dr. Hollis. Towards the end, we may also try the raise your hand feature, where you can click on a feature of the webinar where you can ask questions directly via your webcam if you click that button. There's some audio settings to be aware of. Make sure you've clicked the correct audio choices. There are two choices on your screen. One would be microphone and speaker. The other is telephone. Most people are probably connected by their audio computer system, but if you've dialed in by telephone, you need to click that button. And your microphones are muted initially. There are a few features you'll want to explore in the system. One is what's called the full screen mode, which allows you to enlarge the presentation. There's you can also grab the corner of the windows and slide them to make them larger. Make sure to use the ask a question feature and the chat button as well. We want to let you know of some of the upcoming events. We have another Zurich seminar called Introduction to Alchemy, and this will be featuring Dr. Murray Stein on Wednesday, November 23rd from noon to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, so again a 90-minute piece. And Dr. Stein will be looking at alchemy and doing just a wonderful presentation on that. And if there's interest, we may actually promote that into a full series on alchemy. We have two others coming up prior to that, one from the San Francisco Young Institute and the other the Chicago Young Institute. From San Francisco, we'll be broadcasting a Rilke seminar called Poetry and Alchemy, looking at the author Rilke. That'll be Saturday, November 9th, 12:30 to 3:30 p.m. And the Chicago Young Institute will have one on anima and animus and popular music, Saturday, November 16th. We also want to let you know of an exciting program we have with the limited edition Red Book prints. There are 77 prints from the Red Book itself that are now available for purchase. And if you go to our homepage, the Asheville Young Center homepage, you can click on a banner and it will show you, options for these prints if you want to look at what's available with that. These are very limited edition. They'll be available just for a short time until the prints are gone, in essence, but at least take a look at that if you can. They're really quite striking there, the museum quality prints. We need to let people know that for the continuing education part of our program that we have no commercial support for presenters, topics, or programs. There is no pharmaceutical industry support of any kind associated with us today. You'll also receive the link to an online survey, so if you're able to click on the survey afterwards, that would be greatly appreciated. We are taping the seminar today, so if you would like to remain anonymous, please email your questions to us. Do know that if you open up your microphone or your video camera, you'll have to click that yourselves in order to do that after we invite you to. That will be on the recorded version, so please only do so if you're comfortable being on the recording. And occasionally the chat box can be visible on the recording as well, so just that you're aware of that. Well, I'd like to present to you tonight Dr. James Hollis. James Hollis is a Zurich-trained Jungian analyst who is now in private practice in Houston, Texas. He is the former executive director of the Jung Educational Center of Houston, former professor of Jungian Studies at Saybrook University. Among his publications are numerous articles and 14 books, some of which have been translated into over 16 languages. And the book we're focusing today on is James Hollis' Hauntings. This book just was released July this year, so it's a virtually brand new publication, and it is published through Chiron Publications, and chironpublications.com is where it can be purchased. So without further ado, we're going to turn the video over to Dr. James Hollis. I'm going to mute my system, and he will be taking over momentarily.
I was beginning by suggesting that the metaphor of hauntings is really a way of talking metaphorically about the presence of the past. And the task of depth psychology, of course, is to try to discern the movement of the invisible world as it enters the visible world and affects our behaviors, our bodies, our attitudes, our projections onto other people, and so forth. And in doing so, we realize that sooner or later we all live in haunted houses, and we all sleep in history's unmade bed. And it behooves each of us to remember the wisdom of that observation by the novelist Faulkner, who said the past isn't past. It's not history. It's still present. It's active within us. And it's not dead. It's not even past. And so I wanted to illustrate an example of a person who is very conscious of how she's haunted by the past and seemingly finds herself unable to escape it. It's a poem by Diane Wachowski called The Photos, and recounts a visit she's made to her mother while her sister's visiting too, and it's clear that they don't get together very often. It's clear that there are a lot of subtext going on in this meeting. And as she drives away, she has a number of reflections about her life as she identifies with what's welling up inside of her as a result of that visit. So the poem is called The Photos. My sister in her well-tailored silk blouse hands me the photo of my father in naval uniform and white hat. I say, "Oh, this is the one which Mama used to have in her dresser." My sister controls her face and furtively looks at my mother, a sad rag bag of a woman, lumpy and sagging everywhere, like a mattress at the Salvation Army, though with no holes or tears, and says, "No." I look again, and I see that my father is wearing a wedding ring in this photo, which he never did when he lived with my mother, and that there is a legend on it that says, "To my dearest wife, love, Chief." And I realized the photo must have belonged to his second wife, whom he left our mother to marry. My mother says, with her face as still as the whole unpopulated part of the state of North Dakota, "May I see it too?" She looks at it. I look at my tailored sister and my own blue jean self. Have we wanted to hurt our mother, sharing these pictures on this, one of the few days I ever visit or spend with family? For her face is curiously haunted, not now with her usual viperish bitterness, but with something so deep it could not be spoken. I turn away and say, I must go on, as I have a dinner engagement with friends. But I drive all the way to Pasadena from Whittier, thinking of my mother's face, how I could never love her, how my father could not love her, Yet knowing I've inherited the ragbag body, the same stony face with bulldog jaws. And there, thinking of that face as I'm changing lanes on the freeway, necessarily glancing in the rearview mirror, I see that face, not even a ghost, but always with me like a photo in a beloved's wallet. And oh, how I hate my destiny. Well, that's a person who obviously is caught up in some historic dramas. How many times does she tell us that there's a subtext going on? She contrasts her well-tailored sister with her own blue jean self. She talks about how, despite trying to get away from her mother, she somehow continues in some way to be an embodiment of her mother. And we know that in the face of a powerful message, our greatest tendency is to repeat it, to serve it, particularly if it's operating unconsciously. Or we may find that there's something pernicious in that, so we run in the other direction. And so every time this poet says, I'll try to be anything but my mother, I may in fact wind up somehow becoming her again. And at least I'm being defined by that which I wish not to be. Or one seeks some kind of unconscious treatment plan whereby one is engaging in a life of distraction or a life of addiction and numbing and so forth. But in any case, it's clear that the poet there is caught in the web of history which she wishes to escape. And she's caught somewhere between fate and destiny, which are not quite the same thing. And we have to ask ourselves, all of us, why is life so difficult? Is it because others behave badly toward us? Are we the ones who are causing all this problem? Are we caught in the hands of malevolent gods somewhere, deities who don't care about us per se? Why is it so difficult? Why the repetitions? Why the patterns? When we begin to look at the patterns, we realize that the only person who's consistently present in that long-running melodrama we call our life is ourselves. So we have to have some accountability to how it's turning out. And we begin to realize that many times our patterns are in service to instructions. Again, some of them are conscious and many of them are not conscious. And nothing has more power than that which is working unconsciously in us, because we literally do not know about its effect until at least it spills into the world and we're held accountable for it. As Shakespeare said in Twelfth Night, no prisons are more confining than the ones we know not we're in. And so we begin to realize, as our ancestors did, we often live a haunted existence. For them, they thought of them as ghosts and evil spirits and zombies and spells cast upon people and so forth. And we certainly know energy can go back and forth between people, but we take a different view of it today. In 1919, Jung wrote a fascinating essay on precisely this subject, and it was titled On the Psychological Foundations for the Belief in Spirits. And I'd like to quote just two short passages from that. He observed that in all traditions there is a universal belief in the existence of phantoms or ethereal beings who dwell in the neighborhood of men and who exercise an invisible and powerful influence upon them. These beings are generally supposed to be the spirits or souls of the dead. Now, he goes on to say, from a contemporary psychological point of view, these spirits, viewed from the psychological angle, are unconscious autonomous complexes which appear as projections because they have no direct association with the ego. In other words, whatever is operative within me, of which I'm unconscious, is for that moment outside the sphere of the ego's range of influence and capacity to address directly. So therefore, it's likely to operate within me with a certain degree of autonomy. And when it's built up a certain kind of energy, it can leave me and go out onto others as a projection or be triggered by something in the environment. And again, we don't wake in the morning and say, well, I think I'll have a projection today, but we do. And a projection, again, there's 5 stages to that. First of all is the experience of being in relationship to the other, whether it's an institution or a situation or a person. And that other is viewed through the lens of the projection. But because it's an unconscious mechanism, we literally do not know that what we're doing is viewing that other as other through the lens of our intrapsychic subjective point of view. And secondly, in any projection, we then begin to experience some kind of discrepancy. The other, because it's other, will not conform to the expectations of the projection. It's a little cognitive dissonance. And so we begin to recognize then that the other needs to be somehow brought back into line. And we often then begin to try to maneuver or manipulate or criticize the other and move them back into line. The third stage is often the deterioration into the power complex. In the field of relationship, it's like, what's wrong with you? Why are you not the person I thought you were? Why are you not behaving as my agenda suggests you ought to be? And that's where a lot of relationships founder, as we all know. And the fourth stage is typically the otherness of the other will wear through the projection. And as a result, we'll be left then sort of holding the bag, and the reality of the other shines through. And typically what happens there is our expression of dismay, disappointment, betrayal, upset, and criticism. We can always say, well, you know, you let me down, or you were not providing what I expected from you. And that's usually where relationships end, and we walk away and the projection gets renewed again. Occasionally there's a fifth stage, and that's when a person can make a projection conscious and say, you know, what is it I put out on you, or what is it I put out on that situation? And it's in that moment, which is always humbling, because we realize that's come from inside of me. As Jung was pointing out in his essay in 1919, unless that material is brought into the purview of consciousness, we can never begin to relate to it in any sort of deliberate way. We will be, in a sense, at the mercy of the dynamics of the unconscious. So the problem there, of course, is we can go on to renew that projection over and over and over, and continue to scratch our head at how the world lets us down. And we can blame the world, and we can blame others, or somewhere we may, again, have to recognize I'm the only person present in all those scenes, so therefore it may be coming somewhere from me. And that's the beginning of wisdom, but of course it's a very humbling experience. And our ancestors understood that many times, or they believed, let's put it that way, they believed that people could become possessed by spells, by evil spirits, by the devil. And shamanic and religious and tribal healing often involved some sacred personage who would try to discern what spirit or alien presence had stolen a part of the soul and taken it somewhere, and to go sort of wrestle with that devil or spirit and try to propitiate it or defeat it and bring that missing entity back into the individual. And Jung said, actually, that's not a bad model for understanding the work of modern psychotherapy, when we realize that something called a complex today does capture part of our spirit. This is not a new phenomenon. Approximately 40 centuries ago, there was an Egyptian text, The World-Weary Man in Search of His Ba. And Ba was the word for soul. In other words, a person who understood that somehow he had lost contact with his soul, or something had stolen it. And so we realized that, in a sense, Jung's concept of the complex is so important, because the complex represents the fact that we are historic creatures. It is a charged cluster of our history. We have complexes because we are creatures with a history, and it gets programmed in various ways. Some of those complexes are helpful, beneficent. If you hadn't had some kinds of positive bonding experiences in your early formation, there's little chance that you would care about relationship or be able to be in a healthy relationship, or you wouldn't be able to experience compassion or caring about justice or fair play. But many of the complexes we wind up talking about are ones that are exercising some kind of regressive impulse or some kind of disempowerment, because most of the powerful complexes, of course, come from our earliest sense of self and other, and the sort of traffic in between. And what the British psychiatrist D.W. Winnicott called the false self is not about hypocrisy. It's about the fact that so often we have to make adaptations to the conditions around us. And in so doing, we become in some way enslaved to those adaptations. So that what was once protective may in fact later be constrictive. In other words, in the face of the magnitude of life, we all learn we're powerless and the other is powerful. So, you know, we only have a few choices there, one of which is stay out of harm's way, learn patterns of avoidance. Or if you can, try to get control of the other, which is rarely achieved. Or more commonly, give them what they want, accommodate. And so you'd have to say, now, when do our patterns of avoidance show up in our lives, and what's the cumulative cost from avoiding patterns? Or what is the cost of accommodation all the time? If I'm forever accommodating the other, what appears to be a kind of sweet reasonableness, in fact, becomes what is called codependence, and is really something very ugly. It's a kind of continuous abdication of one's own integrity in the pressure of the stimulus of the moment, which activates our psychic history. Because the human psyche is like an analog computer. Every moment is new. And yet our psyche is saying, in terms of our survival and adaptation, where have I been here before? What do I know about this? What's the appropriate behavior? And what comes up from below can very well be an instruction like, run, get out of here. And again, that might be protective in certain circumstances, but in other circumstances, it's an abdication of accountability. Or it might say, you know, go with the flow. To get along, you go along. And in doing that, we recognize once again, an adaptive behavior becomes a kind of psychic phantasm, a mechanism, if you will, and that mechanism has a life of its own, and it creates patterns throughout our lives. In that way, we realize that we are in service to the spectral presences of the past, whether they're applicable to this present moment or not. The more so as they are unconscious, and therefore the more so as they are autonomous. Additionally, we're affected by things that happen in the culture as well. You know, we are constantly present to cultural influences too, many of which are pernicious. For example, definitions of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, racial roles, socialized modalities. Again, exterior definitions, exterior influences that get internalized in all of us as messages. And again, in the face of a powerful message, you either serve it, or you run from it, or you try to fix it in an unconscious way. And it's never more powerful than when that influence is at work in your life. Again, this is not a new idea. In 1882, Ibsen published a play called Ghosts, in which he was critiquing Norwegian society at the time with its enormous weight of civic accountability, responsibility, and what it did to the psychic life of individuals. Let me just read one paragraph from that play from 1882. The character says, "I'm inclined to think we're all ghosts. It's not only the things that we've inherited from our fathers and mothers that hang on to us, but all sorts of old dead ideas and old dead beliefs and things of that sort. They're not actually alive in us, but they're rooted there all the same, and we can't get rid of them. I've only to pick up a newspaper, and when I read it, I see in them ghosts gliding between the lines. I should think there must be ghosts all over the country, as countless as grains of sand, and we are all so pitifully afraid of the light." Well, it's not common for us to think about being haunted, but every once in a while we stand in the presence of phenomena that cause us to scratch our heads. Once in a while enter therapy and engage in a constructive dialogue about that. Other times to be called up to accountability by a partner or children or someone else. And then we realize we have to deal with something. And we recognize, first of all, as I mentioned, the patterns. Those patterns that are coming, particularly the patterns that are harmful to self and to others, that those patterns often are driven by these psychic phantasms, by instructions, admonitions, prohibitions that once were tied to our survival and adaptation, and today cripple and limit the sphere of the conscious range of choice in our lives. We see these patterns and we know somehow we are accountable for them. Or we're taken over by mood states. You know, we may be doing all the right things outwardly, but we carry a heaviness in our spirit. Or we feel a kind of sort of walking depression, if you will. And in those moments, we realize we're possessed by some kind of psychic content that's not as such available to consciousness. Or, of course, we have dreams that are constantly commenting on how this life is unfolding, as seen by some agency in another frame than that of the ego consciousness. Or even in some cases, people have had visionary experience or hallucinations or so forth. I'm mindful of a mother I know who lost a child, and sort of as a form of denial and trying to move on with her life in good faith, sort of refused to grieve about it. And as the fates would have it, a few years later, she was visiting that same hospital to visit the sick child of a friend of hers. And it all came rushing back, and she had an hallucination that she saw her own child in the halls of that hospital, as once she had, in fact, had to say goodbye to that child there. And it was a hallucination. She knew it was, and at the same time, it snapped something in her, and she was able to grieve, and ironically, to realize that she had been in some way possessed by this trauma so strongly that had led her to complete denial and so forth. Now, again, Jung's had so much of interest to say about that. In his book, The Psychological Types, he says this: among primitives, the imago, or the charged image, the psychic reverberation of the sense perception, is so strong and so seriously colored that when it is reproduced as a spontaneous memory image, it sometimes has the quality of an hallucination. And that's what happened to this mother, and this was just a couple of years ago. Thus, when the memory image of his dead mother suddenly appears to a primitive, it is as if her ghost has appeared that he sees and hears. We may say we only think of the dead, but the primitive actually perceives them because of the extraordinary seriousness of his mental images. This explains the primitive's belief in ghosts and spirits. They are what we simply call thoughts. We should have to add to that highly affect-laden or emotion-laden thoughts. When the primitive thinks, he literally has visions whose reality is so great that he constantly mistakes the psychic for the real. And of course, an example of that would be for us to have a very vivid dream and waken in the morning and say, well, I had a very powerful dream. It was scary or pleasant or whatever. And another time or place, the person would say, I literally made this visit, this voyage. I met my ancestors there, or my ancestors came to me, or whatever the image might suggest. And then we also realize, too, that the psyche is continuously a self-corrective system. This is the good news and the bad news at the same time, because the bad news is often that those self-correctives come to us as what we call symptoms. We may be doing all that we believe is the right thing for our lives, and we experience a debilitating depression. Or we find ourselves caught in the thrall of an addiction of some kind. Or doing the right thing, we find we're doing it without a sense of purpose and satisfaction and so forth. And in other words, the psyche has asserted its autonomy. It's like the depression is saying, we down here, the folks who are really in charge, are refusing to cooperate with the executive suite upstairs as it executes the plan, the game plan that you all have bought into. And so naturally, we would feel from an ego consciousness, how quickly do I get rid of my symptoms? Do I medicate that away? What do I do? And we seldom ask the question, why has it come? In service to what? Or what is it asking to me? Or asking of me? And in those moments, you see, those are very humbling experiences. You can see why this kind of work is not ego-aggrandizing. It's always a form of humbling the ego, because it's obliging us to deal with that which we would prefer not to deal with. And so we can say, okay, well, we don't deal with it. But the point is, it's dealing with us. Many years ago, the Dental Association of New Jersey had a billboard campaign across the state that said, ignore your teeth and they'll go away. Well, ignore these manifestations and we say they'll go away, but of course they don't. And they typically escalate. And we begin then to recognize something here is asking me to deal with it, to take it seriously, and to begin to dialogue with it rather than distract it, numb it, medicated away or whatever. And I've always been haunted by Jung's observation that what I've denied inwardly will have a tendency to come to me as outer fate. Now, that's a very scary thought because it makes me say, what am I denying inwardly? Or to put it another way, of what am I unconscious? And of course, by definition, the problem with the unconscious is it's unconscious. And I can't answer that question categorically. And so I have to say then, okay, how do I read the texture of my life in terms of what the other world is saying to me about how I can begin to discern what the psyche is asking of me? Now, again, we have to recognize that, and I want to talk a little bit, before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit more about some of those other psychic specters. You know, it's kind of a cliche that someone's supposed to, it's almost like a New Yorker cartoon, supposed to go into an office somewhere, lie on a couch, and complain about mother and father. But that's not what how it's about. We're not really, remember, focused on the past. We're focused on the fact that the past isn't past. And that usually the most formative images that we carry, affect-laden images of self and other, and the emotional traffic in between, arises from those early parent-child relationships. So there are elemental axes of value, we might say, that we're making decisions about all the time based on the fortuity of those experiences. Change the experiences, we would have some different conclusions, some different reactions. So for example, one of those spectra that we're in a sense programming is the other safe or unsafe? Can I approach the other? Do I stay away from the other? In the presence of conflict, do I run? Do I engage in warfare? Do I try to placate and pacify the other? Another of the spectrums that we're dealing with is, am I as I am of value? Or do I have to twist and torque myself in some way to get your approval? And if so, what is it that I have to do? Is it hide out, keep my mouth shut? Do I have to become the A student? Do I have to help you carry your depression or anger? Do I have to fix you in some way? What is it I have to do to get that kind of approval? And so forth. And so these kinds of elemental messages that of course are based on the fortuity of a particular time and place and set of circumstances have a tendency to get locked in pretty substantially. Now, fortunately, they get modified by other life experiences. We grow, we become more resilient, we have other experiences that challenge or reinforce, perhaps, the power of those messages. And so as an adult, we may say, well, I'm a free-thinking and cognizant individual, and you know, the ego is always saying to itself in some way, I know who I am, I'm in charge of my life, I can make proper choices. And then, you know, maybe years later, we look back on some very important choices, scratch our heads and say, you know, what was I thinking? Or what was going on there? Or if we're not going to examine it that way, we can always say, well, look at all the people who disappointed me, or look at the people who let me down, and so forth. So we have to start with our earliest sense of self and other, and that comes typically from the parent-child relationship, both in terms of their models, but also the kinds of permission or lack of permission that they are showing us about who we are. Is it permissible to be who I am, to desire what I want legitimately, to ask for life to bring something to me? Or am I somehow to always qualify that in some way? And where are the blockages that come up in those regards? And what's the unfinished business of the family? Jung was particularly haunted by that, you know, when he would question his father about matters of faith in particular, and his father said, well, we don't question that, we just believe. And he said, I tracked my father's lifelong depression to his refusal to ask, you know, important questions. And later he said, when I think of the word father, I think of powerless. And his mother was very unstable and was in and out of hospitalizations for very uncertain and vague causes. And he said later, when I think of the word mother, I think of undependable. So it's like, all right, we'll go out into life with powerless and undependable as your building blocks, and you realize you're either going to be serving that or you're going to be spending a lot of time compensating for that, which I'm sure Jung felt he had to do. So he says in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his memoir, we are frequently under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by parents and grandparents and more distant ancestors. It often seems as if there were an impersonal karma within a family which is passed from parent to children. It has always seemed to me that I had to answer questions which fate had posed to my forefathers and which had not yet been answered, or as if I had to complete or perhaps continue things which previous ages had left unfinished. Now, what he's saying there is that he felt a psychic burden to address unfinished business from the past. And one of his most haunting statements to me is his comment that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. That is to say, wherever I'm stuck, wherever I'm blocked, in those places my children will be blocked, or they will have to be spending a lot of effort to get unblocked, or be caught in some kind of treatment plan for that without even being aware that that's what it's about. And so Jung was particularly aware of how this kind of karma or complex can be transmitted through the generations. And we know our ancestors had the same recognition. The Bible talks about the sins of the parents being passed on at least to the third generation. And psychotherapists usually are working with the third generation. And it's probably more than that, except that it disappears into the mists of history at that point, and most of it remains unknown. In classical Athens, for example, in the tragic vision, they saw how a particular complex or unaddressed issue ripples through the generations, presumably set in motion by an ancestor offending the gods, who places a curse on the lineage, the house of Atreus, the house of Thebes, whatever. And it requires the suffering of a person in the third generation to bring it to consciousness and to break the hold of that history that produces cause, effect, and so forth. And anybody working in the psychotherapeutic fields and social work and so forth is acutely aware of the presence of the sort of the invisible hand, to borrow an economic term for a moment, the invisible hand that plays a role in the lives of people. Now, I'd like to give you a clinical example of this. A person I'm calling Jeffrey. Jeffrey is a person of my generation, a very accomplished, thoughtful person who is now a widower. And Jeffrey spent a good part of his life in the field of natural sciences, but was a person who was always carrying the mantle of the hero complex, which started early in his life. And so part of his project was always to sort of go help people and fix people. And you and I could say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, there's nothing wrong with kindness and compassion and help to others. But when it's driven from a deep unconscious source, it can be a tyranny. It can actually set one up for self-injury, as well as perhaps not even helping someone after all. And so this is a person who devoted his life to an extremely impaired spouse. And with his best efforts, he wasn't really able to save her, and she's now deceased, passed away. And he had this dream the night before. He was about to fly off in a well-intended mission to help his adult daughter in another city. And again, the best of motives, and yet it was the evocation of a familiar pattern. And he had this dream, which I find extraordinary. I included it in the book. And it's a dream that makes one scratch one's head again and say, who would ever think these things up? But it came from his psyche. And we examined it on a Tuesday, and he was flying on a Wednesday. And it did cause him to at least reflect on that mission, and we've talked about it since. And here's the dream in its entirety. He says, my mother has died. She's in a black casket in front of me. My father and others are there, but they are shadows, and they say nothing and glide away out of sight. A doctor and I are going to do an autopsy on the body in the casket. I don't want to do it. The doctor says we must do it so someone gets the benefit from it. I assume someone will get the information from this autopsy. I think, why me? Is this too much for a husband, but okay for a son? The doctor looks like an old-time magician dressed all in black. He has a long rod with which to pry open the casket. I'm afraid of getting a disease from the decayed body. The doctor opens the casket. A woman in a long black dress with puffed shoulders is lying there. She does not look like my mother at any time in my mother's life. The mother looks young, 30-something, and does not look dead. Now I see it's Jolene. I've just given her that name, Jolene, his deceased wife instead. She moves as though awakening from sleep. Before the doctor can touch her, she pushes herself up with her hands so that her upper body is against the lid and facing us. I'm thinking it's Jolene, and I don't want her back alive. The doctor says they would be better off to leave them alone. I assume he means the woman in the casket or people like her. He moves to kill her with the rod and close the casket, and I yell no and stop him. I am horrified at the body coming back to life, but I'm also horrified at killing her again now. The woman berates the doctor, scolds him, and calls him by condescending names like she knows him. I am frozen, huddled up, waiting. She gets out of the casket. She walks away, and she says, I rule here. I'm back. Now she floats swiftly through the air toward me. She kisses me on the lips and quickly floats away like a dark shadow and disappears. The taste of her kiss on my lips is acid bitter. He knows that's the kiss of death. Now, this is an appropriate dream for Halloween, that's for sure. It's a real dream from a man of scientific intellect and profession. And notice, again, that in some way the dream is suggesting to us that the rescue projects that this man has, in good faith, I'm not being critical, I'm being descriptive only, in good faith, he has served all of his life rescue missions. It started long ago and far away as a child with his emotionally needful mother. It transferred to choosing a person who would replicate that, albeit unconsciously, because that was part of the projection that led to his engagement and marriage. And the many years of distressful living. And it's going on into the third generation, as we know. And he felt that maybe examining the body of all of this with the magician was some reference to his therapist in this dream. But, by probing this, we've somehow, raised the dead, if you will. But as you can see, the dead are not dead, and they are present. And as she says so clearly, I just want you to know, I'm still in charge here. I rule here, not you. You may think you run your life, but I'm in fact running your life for you. Excuse me. Now, when we think about that, we realize, in a sense, what clearer message could there be? That the person is living in a haunted house, that the person is in the grip of a spectral presence, and that goodness, which has characterized so much of his life, and I honor that goodness, at the same time has often been at his own expense and led to futile, in a sense, quixotic projects. And the dream is again dreamt the night before he's off on still another one. And I could say our continued discussion of that dream has led to some further considerations of that. Pardon me. I've been talking all day, and I'm a little hoarse, and it shows up from time to time. So we have all kinds of relational ghosts, as we know. We can't have relations with others, particularly intimate relations, because the more intimate the relationship, the more it triggers the primal material. Again, the psyche saying, where have I been here before? What do we know about this? What does that programming tell us we should do? Does it mean I'm in the relationship, but I'm not really there, because that way I don't get intruded upon? Life is punitive otherwise, or invasive? Or does it mean that I have to struggle for control continuously? Or Do I wind up in accommodating patterns? You know, what are the messages going on that build up in every relationship? And part of the sort of pernicious aspect of this, which is kind of hard to believe, but I've seen it over and over, is how our internal radar gets programmed to find people in order to repeat these things. You know, Freud noted that a century plus ago in his concept of the repetition compulsion. And again, why are we compelled to do it? Because of the power of these operative complexes that were once central to our sense of self and other and the relational strategies in between. So we develop in the face of the powerful other patterns of avoidance, power issues, patterns of accommodation. Or the opposite of that, the insufficiency of the other, you know, the deficits of the other are often internalized by the child as a statement to me about me. In other words, I don't realize my mother's depressed and therefore her lack of smile toward me is not really about me, or my father's fatigue from work, or whatever the case may be. I internalize all that as about me, and that creates a kind of deficit sense of self, which is that ubiquitous wounding to self-esteem that we all experience in one fashion or another. And that shows up in two reactive patterns. The most common is patterns of avoidance in our life, patterns of self-sabotage, patterns whereby we don't step forward into the life that we want because we are carrying diminished sense of permission and opportunity and empowerment to ask for that and to work for it. Or the reverse of that, patterns of grandiosity, patterns of overcompensation, saying, look how important I am, and so forth. And you know people like that. Or secondly, again, the power complex, where we wind up using others for self-gratification, particularly for our self-esteem needs. And I don't know any parent who's been wholly free of not wishing his or her child to carry some of that unfinished narcissistic need, and to say, I'm expecting my child to make me proud of them, to make me feel good about myself, and to grow up and maybe endorse my values and replicate my choices in life and that kind of thing. And have often, one way or the other, suppressed the independence of that child. And so it takes a very strong and wise parent to pull back that kind of agenda and not dump it on others, or we use our partners for our self-esteem. And thirdly, there's an inordinate need for reassurance from the other. And it's often that kind of neediness that shows up in a fashion that literally pushes people away and actually leads to the opposite outcome. It can also be the source of addictions as people are looking for the temporary assuagement of that existential anxiety generated by the experience of abandonment or isolation, and in connecting to the other, be it a warm body or a substance or a behavior or whatever the addictive hook might be. Now, in addition, other forms of the haunting of the past that affect us are such things as guilt and shame and betrayal. Now, when we think about them, for example, we realize that anxiety always vests us in the future about that which could happen, that which possibly might happen. And guilt, shame, and betrayal always root us in the past. Ironically, how often are we truly in this moment and truly able to make conscious decisions based on a conscious assessment of the reality of the situation of the moment, when in fact we're caught up in patterns of anxiety and anticipatory emotion, or again, the sort of engines, if you will, of the past that cast their spell over us. And in a sense, it's sort of like we're being haunted by an alternative sense of ourselves. So when we think of guilt for a moment, there is that kind of guilt that is authentic, where I've hurt myself or hurt others, and the acknowledgement of that makes me a civilized human being. And there's a place for authentic acknowledgement of guilt. A person without any guilt would be a sociopath or psychotic, and would be unable to have relationships with others. But there's also a kind of guilt that's contextual, whereby I recognize that we live in an exploitative society, and many times the advantages I might have are at the expense of other people's and other parts of the world and so forth. And that's a form of social sensibility and sensitivity. But much of the time, what we're talking about in guilt, when we say I feel guilty about something, is really a form of anxiety. We rationalize it as, you know, this is what I wish to say, or this is what I actually feel, but it puts me in some harm's way, so I can't do it. I would feel guilty in doing it. You know, the old cliche, why do I feel guilty when I say no? And the answer is, I'm not feeling guilty, I'm feeling anxious. And what we call guilt is really a kind of internal governor that is designed to protect us from being in that exposed position vis-a-vis the other. And so if you simply submit for, or substitute, I should say, for the feeling of anxiety, or for the feeling of guilt, I feel anxious in this moment. Okay, what are you anxious about? What is that about, really? And if you really can probe it, it'll come up like, if I say what I really think, I'm afraid of your punitive reaction. Or if I ask for what I really wish in life, and I feel is appropriate here, I might lose your approval and your favor. Now, those things, punitive behavior, retaliation, loss of approval, for a child are devastating. And that's, again, where that wiring reaches into the basement that literally shuts down the capacity of the adult to function as a free and autonomous being, because he or she is overruled by the activation of the wires that metaphorically reach into the basement and activate that archaic field of anxiety that rushes up and floods the person. And to protect ourselves, we say, I'm guilty if I do that, or I feel guilty if I do this. Rather than say that, we say, I'm really anxious. And it sometimes helps one smoke that out. And then one has to say, all right, what is it I'm really anxious about? And A, is that likely to happen? Or B, even if it were to happen, sometimes that's the price of authenticity. Remember, Jung defined neurosis once as neurosis is a behavior that has not found its meaning yet. You know, he said it's neurosis is inauthentic suffering. Sometimes real life requires suffering, conflict, differences, the risk of life. And to avoid that is the neurosis in Jung's view. It's protective, yes, but that means we have not stepped into our life and our potential. The second thing is, of course, shame. And all of us carry shame one way or the other. And shame shows up again in two basic ways, and you can probably see both in your life at some point. Shame will show up again by not showing up, by our avoidance, by our not taking on the possibilities of life as we want, because we feel insufficient, inadequate, or undeserving. It also shows up in overcompensated behavior, grandiosity, for example. Look how rich or powerful or influential I am, or something like that, which is really rising out of a bedrock of shame. And it comes from two places: feeling that we've not measured up to some standard. Maybe we carry the admonition of a parent as a kind of cosmic judgment about us, or we failed, we think, to help our parents or heal them or fix their lives, and we feel shamed by that. Or sometimes people are shamed by their context, their environment. Why would a child be shamed by poverty, for example, or alcoholism, or social conditions or violence? And the answer is because we all, in some way, feel we are contiguous as children with our environment. I am what's happening around me. The world's a statement to me about me. So shame-based behavior is another example of the domination of the present in a person's life by the spectral presences of the past. And we have to recognize what shame makes us do or keeps us from doing. And of all these ghosts that we're talking about, metaphorically, we have to ask that very basic pragmatic question. What is it making me do, or what is it keeping me from doing? If we can identify that, then we have the capacity to say, but I'm not an automaton, I'm not at the mercy of that, I can act otherwise. And then the third form of domination by the past is betrayal. The truth is, we let other people down, we betray their interests, we've been betrayed by others, and we often get stuck at that point. And when you see a person grinding away many years afterwards, and saying, you know, so-and-so let me down, or so-and-so did this, or even people who are complaining too much about the parents or whatever the cause may be, however legitimate that cause. When we're stuck in that sense of betrayal, we are choosing to hang on to that past. We are choosing to be defined by that past. Now, betrayal can quicken consciousness as well. It can force us to say, what part did I play in that, if any? And that's part of growing up and being accountable. Or we can say, you know, maybe I turned over too much of my project of growth and development to that person. You know, a young couple getting married is frequently serving an unconscious agenda that says basically, I'm counting on you to fix my life for me, make it work for me, help me, you know, avoid growing up and doing all that for myself. And if I'm really lucky, I want you to be the perfect parent that I've always been looking for. Now, no one says that consciously because we'd be embarrassed, number one. Number two, we don't know that it's really coursing within us. But then later on, when the relationship hits whatever realistic skids it hits, we often say, you know, you betrayed me, you let me down, et cetera, et cetera. And we get stuck at that point. And so betrayal is one of those things where the question is not whether there was injury, of course there was, and sometimes grievous injury and grievous harm, but to say, am I hanging on to it? And if I'm hanging on to it, that's on my watch, because that's meaning that I'm allowing myself to divert energy there to the past, to invest it in the past, and I'm refusing in that moment to be able to take that energy and move it forward. We also feel betrayed by life. We can set off and do the best we can, follow the most intelligent game plan we can imagine, and life turns out in other ways. And anyone in the second half of life is painfully aware of discrepancies. Discrepancies between what we expect from others and what we receive, discrepancies between who we want to be and how our life has turned out, discrepancies everywhere in the universe. Remember Robert Frost's little couplet? He said, forgive, O Lord, my little joke on thee, and I'll forgive thy great big joke on me. So he was feeling a cosmic sense of betrayal. And that's what the whole book of Job was about, of course, almost 3 millennia ago, where an individual says, you know, I followed faithfully to the best of my ability the contract I was given, and I can swear before the gods that I did so in good faith and with proper behavior. And then injustice abounds. And of course, what the book of Job is about is saying, you know, life happens. In fact, there's no contract. In fact, life isn't fair. And whatever life is, it also operates at a plane of mystery that is wholly inexplicable to human consciousness. And what that work is really about is a critique by a very sensitive Hebrew poet of the assumptions of his time and of the sort of theology of the moment that was unwittingly hubristic, as if we could make a deal with the universe and had the powers to do such and hold the universe to that same deal. And that is unconsciously hubristic and based on an assumption that doesn't exist. Now, again, underneath all of this is our effort to try to make sense of our lives and trying in some way to deal with all those things that sort of go bump in the night and to recognize that the best sort of encounter we can ever have with the unconscious is simply to survey the wreckage we leave behind us, the patterns that have a large grip in our lives, the compensatory symptoms that are constantly calling attention to themselves, the compensatory dreams. Jung believed those dreams and symptoms were engineered by the self as an ongoing commentary to present the ego with an invitation to dialogue and to present the ego with an agenda for reconsideration. And naturally, the more insecure the ego, the less it's able or willing to undertake that kind of dialogue, and the more that it's going to try to slip slide away, to blame others, to rationalize, to spin the facts, create useful fictions, and when that fails, to anesthetize in some way. And so underneath all of this is a summons to consider the reality of the human psyche, or the human soul, which is what psyche means from the Greek, and to realize that the conduct of a more thoughtful life invariably involves a humbling and respectful dialogue with the self, capital S, not to be confused with the ego, and it's going to lead to a kind of agenda of growth if we're able and willing to take it on. In addition, we have to recognize that we're all at some level also experiencing the hauntings of the culture that we live in too. This has been called the modern era, it's been called the postmodern era, and we realize that the task of myth historically for the tribe was to help people have a sense of locus in the cosmos. What is the cosmos about? Who are the gods? What is their intention to us? What is it they wish of us? What is it they wish for us? Whither do we go after this life? To allow us to live in proper relationship to nature around us, to understand who our tribe is, and to understand what it means to belong to some corporate identity. And fourthly, to understand what my own journey is about, and to have some points of guidance, some points of reference to help me steer my course across the sea or through the dark forest. Now, with the faded institutional authority for many, many in the modern world, not everyone, but most, for its replacement by surrogate secular forces, we realize that more and more individuals are left to the mercy of the modern era and are literally, spiritually, psychologically adrift. So we recognize that the answer that modern secular psychology, or excuse me, secular culture has offered for the modern, in place of the operative tribal myth or the sacred tradition for most of millions upon millions of people, is on the one hand the secular alternatives of hedonism, narcissism, and materialism, of course. You sort of fill the spiritual, psychological emptiness through the acquisition of objects, and that's somehow supposed to take care of that. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, just how well is that working for us? Because that's what we see all around us. The sort of reflexive response of fundamentalisms of all kinds, religious, political, psychological, etc. And fundamentalisms are all efforts to, as Jung said, the regressive restoration of the persona, to go back to the way things were, is a kind of regressive effort to reconstitute what appeared to be certainties, and to understand the world in black and white terms, and me good, you bad, that kind of thing. And in so doing is a reflexive anxiety management system generated by the encounter with ambiguity and by change. And ambiguity and change produce anxiety in the individual. And so such persons then will often sort of bail out of the struggle to move forward in the face of change and ambiguity and retreat to an earlier position. And then, of course, we have an entire culture of drugging and distraction. And so increasingly with the electronic era, which we're taking advantage of tonight, of course, there is the possibility of a kind of 24-hour buzz, 24-hour sense of connection, a 24-hour sense of, sort of being sort of taken through one's troubles into a distraction. And as I said to one client once, your whole life has been what I call the distracted life. And it hit her as speaking the one truth of her entire adult life. It's like been a flurry of activity, a flurry of investment in projects, but all the distracted life. And distraction from what? Well, the distraction from that conversation with oneself, with one's own soul. That's nothing new. Blaise Pascal in the 17th century talked about how the court invented the gesture, that even the king, if he think of self, will grow miserable. And so the king and the court had to be distracted by the gesture. And so much more in our contemporary era, with the erosion of the tribal mythologies and the sacred traditions, helping locate people in the cosmos. So individuals are thrown back into sort of dilemma of I encountered my soul in the magnitude of that journey, or I'm terrified and intimidated by it, and I will look for some sort of buzzing, distractive other that keeps me from encountering that. Now, we also have to, again, recognize that as we want to work through these things, we have to ask some basic questions. You know, who am I apart from my history? My history can be good or bad or a mixture, whatever. Who am I apart from that? Who am I apart from my roles, which may be good roles or bad roles, as the case may be? Who am I apart from my commitments, which may be very rich and valuable, like partnership, parenting, citizenship, etc., etc. And yet to say, all right, what is it that really wants to enter the world through me? You know, that's a different question. Because remember, that world of adaptation that was so critical for us is also in some way constrictive. It also in some way is the most haunting thing of all, because it also prevents us from being the servants of whatever wants to enter into this life through us. And that's not about ego aggrandizement, it's really about service. The human ego has to ironically be strong enough to say, what is it I'm called upon to serve, really? Because I can assure you, most of the time, the human ego is in service to these very extensive anxiety management systems. And again, they're there for good reason. I'm not here to judge them. They represent the necessary survival and adaptation of the child. And at the same time, we have to recognize that they bind us to that disempowered past. And of all the hunting, the most devastating arises from the unlived life. You know, and Kierkegaard said, and I use this as the epigraph for the last chapter on that subject, the most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the life you will never have. And so we realize then that there's a summons to show up in this world in a larger, more embodied way. And the irony is the enemy to that is in fact the presence of these disabling adaptations and messages. We can't help the fact that we're there, but we're still accountable for the choices that occur in their presence. And Jung said, and I'd like to share this with you. He said this in a lecture while he was still an undergraduate in the Zofinga lectures, which were student debate societies. He said, the world is full of ghostly doings. Every moment of our lives is trying to tell us something, but we do not care to listen to the spirit voice. When we are alone and still, we are afraid that something will be whispered in our ears. And so we hate the stillness and anesthetize ourselves through sociability. And that's Jung as an undergraduate back in the 1890s. How much would he think of our present noisy distractions? And of course, our ultimate job is to sort of show up in life as we are and as who we are. And over, I find, you know, really good people expressing a kind of general malaise, a desire for something different. Their job's okay, maybe their marriage is okay, the relationship to life is okay, but then again, it's not. And when one starts to push against this malaise, one hears over and over rationalizations to justify, well, that's just the way I am, or that's the way things are, or that's the way things have always been. And we realize, you know, in the face of those rationalizations, those complexes, those messages, those spectral presences gain even more power. They're even more institutionalized. And all of them could be facts of one kind or another, but the psychological mischief they play in our life is literally devastating. Because sooner or later, the real issue is found in what are the complexes or messages that are blocking that life and stepping into a larger place. Jung put it this way. He said, we all walk in shoes too small for us. Meaning by that, we live in our adaptive behaviors. Again, necessary at one point, and today constrictive, of course. And we realize that we remain stuck as a result of that. And we remain blocked and defined by that history, with all the calculus of cost that that's going to bring up. And as we know, life is powerful and very, very intimidating in many ways. But, you know, when I start with that poem by Diane Wachowski, She said, you know, how I hate my destiny. Well, she might have meant fate. I'm fated to become my mother, but the word she used was destiny. Destiny is that which we are capable of becoming. And it's almost as if she's saying, and I'm not sure how she's exactly meaning that word, it's as if she's saying, I can't help but myself, but somehow become that or which I don't want to become. But in so doing, I'm actually sabotaging my destiny, that which I'm capable of becoming. And we realize that while there's a certain inevitability of our falling short of our possibilities for all of us, at the same time, the ghosts live in those discrepancies. And I'm always sort of stimulated, believe it or not, by a line from Samuel Beckett, who said once, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. So in a sense, what we have to do is try again and fail better. You know, the great American psychologist Woody Allen said once that 90% of life is showing up. And I think he's right. And the task, though, is to show up as we are. And that means showing up in the face of the fearful, of the intimidating, of the extraordinary power of history, and the extraordinary power of those protective mechanisms that we all developed. And I don't want to belabor this because I think it's time for us to turn to our questions, but I think each of us needs to say, yeah, I live in a haunted house. That's the nature of the fact that we are historic creatures carrying our history with us. Everything that's ever happened to some degree is present within us and can be activated neurologically and then affectively and then as a kind of buried message given the circumstances of our outer life. And we're still called to be here. We're still called to undertake that project that Jung called individuation. And individuation is not individualism, it's about service to what wants to enter the world through us. And in some way, this is this sort of domination by the past is a flight from or abrogation of a spiritual calling. Jung said the achievement of personhood is a divine vocatus, a vocation. It's what we're called to do and be. And the enemy always is the power of history, our refusal to confront it, and our timorousness in the face of the summons to life. And when we can face that and address that, life changes. We bring to our partners a more evolved person. We bring to our children a greater range of possibility and imaginative opening. And we bring to our society whatever the gift of our personhood may be. In those moments, we may still be living in haunted houses, but we are not at that moment subjected to the ghosts in their sort of fearful agendas. So could we open this now to your comments and questions, and I'd be happy to respond to whatever comes to your mind, please.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate that. You've just done a marvelous job, today. As wonderful as your written voices, your spoken voices, equally, if not more so marvelous. So I just want to thank you so much for that. That was delightful. Len Cruz came up to me as we were scrambling, today, and we tested everything right before we started. Everything was working fine. Audio was great, and literally the minute before we started, suddenly the recording system went down. And then once we got that going, the audio system went down. Len came up to me and said, "Steve, what is haunting our seminar today?" And I just stopped in my tracks and said, "Well, Len, that is right on target. Something pretty incredible is haunting our seminar." And we've done 40 of these, and we've never had a beginning like that before. This is the first time we've had that. But maybe it was haunting, and maybe something was trying to break through to us with that. Now we got about a 20-minute late head start with things, and sorry, we got a late start today, and so we're going to go at least till 10:20 Eastern time. You can calculate what that will be to other time zones. And if we want to go a little bit farther, we certainly can as well. Evanston, I know you've got a group there. Towards the very end, we might try and get brave and open up your microphones, so be thinking about that. We're going to first take other questions first. Those in the home audience, there's probably about 40 to 50, live at this point. Go ahead and type out a question or two for Dr. Hollis. Again, we may have been at it full time, but now is the time to go ahead and start typing out those questions. We've already gotten a few, and so I'm going to go ahead and read at least one of those. But in the meantime, perhaps people can be typing their questions as well, and I'll see if there's any in Asheville that want to participate too. That may be by written comment. The first one that came in, let me read this one to you, Jim, and you can let me know any thoughts you have on that. And it comes in, it was an email, it was an anonymous, it says, is it fair to characterize ghosts as anything that interferes with the process of individuation? And if so, is our life's call to let go of these ghosts? Any thoughts on that, Jim? Any thoughts on that, Jim?
Well, I would certainly concur. What we're really talking about is there can be helpful ghosts too. It's simply a metaphor for talking about the fact that that history is always charged with a cluster of energy. I said as I was concluding, everything that's ever happened is still within us. It's programmed at some level. Most of the things that happen to us are so trivial and insignificant that they don't come up and affect our lives. But the things that most affect our lives had to do with the core sense of self, sense of other, and the kind of emotional traffic or strategies for relatedness. And so much of that is, of course, at the mercy of whatever fate throws us into family of origin or a cultural context and religious traditions and other factors wholly beyond our control. And it's where those messages, as they're internalized, because remember, more than one child can have the same kind of experience and internalize it in quite a different way. And you can see how children raised with the same cereal and the same parents and the same household will often move in diametrically opposed fashion. As I said at the beginning, in the face of a powerful message, our tendency, particularly if it's unconscious, is to serve it, to follow its program, and that's what produces these patterns. Or something in us says, that's not healthy or that's not good for you, run in the other direction. So every time I say I'm not that, I'm still being defined in some way by that. I'm living in a reactionary way rather than something coming out of one's own nature. Or thirdly, again, the unconscious treatment plan, which we do that ranges from all kinds of issues, and I won't go into some of those. But the point is, it's fair to say that we're focusing on the noisome ghosts, the ones that are problematic to us, because they're the ones that get between us and the life that we're capable of living, where our own nature unfolds in a more spontaneous way. And I'll give you a quick example. The great majority of people I only see one person at this moment in what I would call the first half of life. And the others just show up, and they're typically 50 and over. And I would say for all these good individuals, all accomplished people, every single one of them has at some point had some significant lack of permission. And by permission, I mean the sort of invitation to be who you are, to feel what you feel, to desire what you desire, and to go seek the life that you want. Sounds simple. The truth is, again, we all learn life is conditional. You meet the conditions, and your well-being depends on meeting those conditions. And don't cross these lines because there's going to be a penalty or there's going to be a significant cost there. And so every one of them has accomplished in the world according to the world's sort of standards and dictates, but inwardly is a split and divided soul, as we all are. And so we should also say there are probably positive ghosts. Remember Casper the Ghost, who used to be part of the comics? There are presences that are supportive to us. Parents whose models or encouragement to us serves as a powerful base for the launching of the next stage of our development. So obviously we focus on the ones that are problematic because the good ones tend to take care of themselves. But the truth is none of us would have gotten this far without some positive experiences in our lives. And when we talk about a complex, remember that the word complex in German is simply a neutral word, like apartment complex, airport complex. It's a structure that's charged with history, with energy. And with that charge, is a somatic manifestation because it always affects us in our body, and much of that's even measurable. There's a feeling tone that is attached to it, and there's a as Jung said, it's a splinter personality. So we become that for a moment. And every time a person says something like, "I don't know what got into me yesterday," or "I was beside myself with anger or grief or whatever," or "when I was talking to my mother, I suddenly became this child again," they're experiencing the activation of that splinter personality. And with every splinter personality, there is a fractal script as well, which is going to serve out the same old, same old. The problem with the complex is it has no imagination. It's a looping tape that will say the same thing over and over and over. And that's what produces patterns, for good or ill, in our lives. And that's why we have to pay attention to the psyche, because it's coming from a perspective outside that looping tape. The ego doesn't create the dream. The self does. It doesn't create the symptoms. It doesn't create in us the feeling function. In other words, when we're doing what's right for us, the feeling supports us. Even when something is costly and painful and conflictual, if it's right for us, we have a sense of purpose to it, a sense of meaning. We are the meaning-seeking, meaning-creating animal, and we suffer more from the loss of meaning than any other single wound in our life. And the problem is when those messages buried in all of us interfere with our experience of meaning. See, I have not used the word happiness this whole night until this moment. I never speak about happiness. I'm not against happiness. Happiness as a goal is illusory. It ultimately can trivialize people, or it can make them obsessional about this. And when we get there, we find there's no there. It's a transient state that feels wonderful when it happens, but it's not something you can own. Meaning is something else. When we are doing what is right for us, we experience its meaning even when it is costly. And when we're doing what is wrong for us, we suffer the loss of meaning. And underneath is the invitation to take seriously that psychic presence in us that is constantly speaking to us in that way.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you so much. Boy, a lot of questions have been coming in. We've got about a dozen or so that just popped up in the last few minutes. It's really triggering some excellent thoughts. I'm sorry, just kind of, okay, here we go. This is from Constance Avery Clark, and it says, at the beginning of the book, Dr. Hollis, you reflect on the fact that you had thought you were finished writing, but that you were haunted, compelled to write the latest book. Would you be willing to share something about this haunting energy that motivated you to go ahead and write again? Yeah, that's from Constance.
Okay. Well, I mentioned in the preface that I had been overly committed in terms of my work schedule, and I was looking forward to some evenings without pressure. I work all day, and when I write, it's when I write at this time of evening, and I was sort of trying to take it easy, as it were. And I found myself with some disturbing dreams, some of them very humorous, and I mentioned one in great detail where, of all things, the spirit of General Grant came to me, and I mean, it's ridiculous imagery, and yet the more I puzzled with it, the more I began to realize it was calling me to some task. And I would wake sometimes at 4 in the morning with paragraphs forming in my head. And sometimes I would get up and write them down. Other times I wouldn't, as we do with our dreams and so forth. And so to make this long story short, I found myself being haunted by something unlived within me. It's almost like being pregnant and saying, well, I kind of forgot that it's supposed to produce a baby. And the baby wants to come whether you want it to or not. And so it set me back to my labors, pulling the oar in the galley, as it were. And I learned something from that, and that was if the psyche wants it, it's going to keep knocking on the door. And we can keep ignoring it, and I did for a while, until it knocked a little harder, and I finally said, okay, it's back to the smithy, and we'll see what we pound out on the anvil this time. And frankly, I've already gotten haunted by some more images, so I don't know what they're going to do, but My guess is something else is stirring within. And I think it's, again, what that represents is not an ego activity. In fact, what I'm saying is my ego was actually resistant, but it was, again, something wanting to enter the world through us. And at some level, it's not ours to choose. It's something that is a summons to serve. And so if I'm going to practice what I've been talking to you tonight, then I have to be open to serving that which wants to enter the world through me. And so that's how this book happened. And I think there's another something forming already in the unconscious, and I get nudges from it from time to time. Steve?
Steve, we need to turn your microphone on.
Okay, sorry about that. We've been haunted yet again. The ghost in the machine is still getting us. Okay, juggling too much here right now. We've got a lot of good questions. I was trying to sort through them to see which one to go with next. There's a good one here I'd like to ask you, Jim. This is from Darla Dench, and it says, in working with dreams and other contents of the psyche, how do we distinguish between helpful ghosts, archetypes which are signaling the soul's calling to individuate, and ghosts who represent stuck patterns and who work to keep us in the past? Any thoughts with that? Hold on, we got
that's the task. And what it summons us to is a lifelong discernment process. In other words, it's not like in the movies where you see somebody has a great dream and suddenly everything's resolved in their life. It's an ongoing dialogue. It's a process. Jung used the Swiss term Auseinandersetzung, that means sort of dialoguing with or having it out with the other side. And a discernment process means sorting through the traffic. You know, I think it's in the book of John in the Bible that says that you have to sort through the spirits or test the spirits to see which ones are the devil, so to speak, and which one are the angels. And you have to sort of understand. Let's say if you have a dream that says, right, move to Toledo. And so you say, okay, I'm going to follow my dreams. You move to Toledo. And you get to Toledo, and the dream the next night says, no, it was Dayton we had in mind, not Toledo. So you don't literalize the image, but you say, I've got to watch the motifs and to see where they're tending, where they're coming from. And it does involve some measure of not only dialogue, but a measure of risk, where one says, what would I be led to choose if I take this image or this issue seriously? Where will that take me? And I think, again, that's a humbling dialogue. It's not like we have some sort of magic access to the great unconscious that's going to just tell us all what to do with our lives. It comes to us in symbolic forms. And Jung was asked once, is nature trying to deceive us? It speaks so mysteriously. And he said, no, nature speaks truthfully, but it speaks the language of nature, which is the symbolic life. He said our ancestors were closer to that, to plant life, to animal life, to the mystery of the spheres around them, to the symbolic world. And he said our task is to try to relearn the approach to the symbolic world. And when we do, we begin to realize that the real function of a symbol is not to clank out a message that says do this and don't do that, but with rare exceptions. It's rather to point us in a direction toward. A symbol points beyond itself towards something that is ultimately inexplicable. So let's say if a person has repeated images of travel or repeated images of living in a different place, it may not mean moving. It may mean, in any physical way, it may mean, all right, it's time for you psychologically to get unstuck. How many times have people said, I'd like to do this, but? You know there's a but in that sentence. You know what's following. I'd like to do this, but I don't have the time to do that. I'd like to do this, but I don't have the money to do that. I don't have time to do, I'd like to do this, but the children, you know, and so on. And that's, again, one of the surest signs of a blocking complex is the ready presence of a rationalization to justify it, to legitimize it. That's another reason why we stay so stuck. Because in a sense, we ratify it and reinforce it every time we collude with it. And so if the motif in the dream was repeated journeys and travels, maybe it's saying the journey has to be in here. The journey has to be where we move to the next stage of our own personal growth and development. Or it may mean to remember what fired our imagination as youth and we left behind, maybe out of good reasons. Those parts of our personality we left behind. Those talents, those enthusiasms, those capacities that we had that we always wanted to try, but felt costly at the time or were superseded by other reality demands. Well, again, they haven't gone away. So the answer to your question is, there's no ready formula for that, but there has to be a discernment process. And with that discernment process, over time, people reach clarity. Marie-Louise Wonfrance was asked once for her secret of, or her understanding of therapy, and she said, well, I don't have any theory, but then she went on to explain her theory. She said, I don't know what's right for a person, but something inside of them knows what's right for them. And she said, I try to pay attention to their work with as much humility and faithfulness and discipline that what is right for them begins to emerge. And they hopefully have acquired that pattern of attentiveness and discipline from me. And then what is right for them is something that they can begin to introduce into their lives. And similarly, Jung wrote in a letter in about 1950, he said the opus of individuation consists of 3 parts, of which psychology only helps us with the first part. And that's to give some sense of insight into the dilemma. He said, then come the moral qualities of the individual. The second is courage to face what must be faced. And third is persistence, endurance, sticking it out. That in a sense, it's clear to me, the nature of our nature is growth and change and psychospiritual enlargement. Stasis is death. Regression is death. We're always being asked to learn more, to take something on, to grow and develop. And when we do that, we're serving life, not necessarily the comfort of the ego. We don't necessarily fit in better. We don't necessarily become the peg in the hole. But we're encountering inside a kind of reciprocity. As I invest in those values, somehow they invest in me. They support my journey. They do it through the energy systems, which are available for doing what the psyche wants us to do, the feeling function, which supports us, and most of all, that most intangible of things, a sense of meaning, that whether people understand it or not, it somehow means whatever it means to you. And that when we are in harmony with that, no matter what else is going on, we feel the rightness of our journey. And when we're not, we always feel the wrongness of it, whether we ever take that seriously or not. Stephen?
Yes, thank you. We're right at 90 minutes. Let's ask another question or two, and then we'll be winding down in just a little bit more. We'll see if we can bend Jim's ear a little bit longer. The one comment I'm going to read, and then maybe a question after that. This one is from Constance Avery Clark, who says, I am sure that there are many of us listening tonight who look forward to nothing more than you being prodded to write more. I guess we should thank your unconscious for prodding you. So that was a nicely worded encouragement to your unconscious that maybe you'll be haunted tonight by another book writing angel. And then there's another one by Lisa Sacco. I'd like to read. Says, I very much enjoyed your talk. Does your book include concrete interventions one can add to interpreting these ghosts? I like depth psychology and its conceptualizations, but fundamentally I'm a pragmatist. There's a smiley face after that. So any thoughts with that?
Well, I'm not sure what kinds of interventions you talk about. I mean, life is always intervening. Symptoms intervene. Sometimes people have to get in our face and saying what you're doing is hurtful to yourself or to others, and that can get our attention. Sometimes the consequences pile up, and you could say that's an intervention. But again, there are some very pragmatic questions. I think of myself as a realist, as a pragmatist. That's why I said the practical questions are, what is a particular issue or value or dilemma? What is it making me do? What is it keeping me from doing? A second question is of any choice, of any relationship, of any career, of any sort of juncture in one's life, ask yourself this elemental question. Does this path make me larger or does it make me smaller? And I would submit to you that most of the time we know the answer to that question right away. We know it intuitively. And if you don't know, keep asking the question and it will be revealed to you. Remember, Jung said we all walk in shoes too small for us. So it's like, our protections make us smaller, and that's understandable. The protections were necessary. But we are also here with a kind of adult capacity and resiliency that was not available in the past. And yet those past systems so often overrule that capacity for us to push through and to survive and to face our fears and to step into a larger summons to ourselves. And when we do that, something in us supports us. It truly does. And that's the path of enlargement. And the old spectral presences of the protections and the adaptations, once useful, diminish our lives. And underneath, if we're going to live in good faith with our own souls, we have to honor that. And Jung said once, there was no one who came to him who did not at some level know what he or she needed to do with their lives. And he said a practical question for every therapist is, what task is this person's neurosis helping him or her avoid? Now, by neurosis, he didn't mean anything neurological. He meant, how is this person's adaptations, avoidances, counter behaviors, whatever, helped him or her avoid the task of showing up?
Yes, thank you so much. Boy, what a wonderful presentation. I have thoroughly enjoyed today, Jim, and really appreciate that. Again, apologies for the glitches, the hauntings that seem to keep affecting us, like poltergeists today for some reason. But we got a wonderful talk nonetheless once we got things going. We'll be winding down in just a moment. I do want to try to get the Evanston Young Center on board just to kind of see the official part is over. So Evanston, there's no pressure. If your webcam doesn't work, that is certainly fine as well. But let's see. I know you have a big crowd, or at least did in the beginning of the talk. Any thoughts, comments, or questions from Evanston?
Any questions?
And can you get your webcam going? It'd be great to see your room. There we go.
We're
I have something. I would just like to.
Nice seeing my friends out there. Hello to Evanston.
okay here. I don't know if it's a Steve.
Yes.
I have one question for you here.
Excellent. Go ahead.
I guess I'm just uncomfortable with the word primitive, that you refer to a group of people frequently as primitive, and I guess I would rather hear it as like indigenous or something that would make them equal with us, that they have things to teach us. And it's not risen above them.
Mm-hmm. Jim, were you able to hear the question? It's a little bit quiet, but could you hear it on your side?
I'm sorry, I couldn't. No, I couldn't. I'm sorry.
Okay. So try that again. Sorry. Jim, go ahead and turn up your volume a little bit. I'm going to mute. And Evanston, look at the computer if you could, as opposed to the monitor. There you go. And then speak a little bit louder if you could. I'm going to mute mine. Just that might help a little bit.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me? No.
Yeah.
I can't. You still can't hear me, right? Can you hear me?
I can hear her now. Yes.
Oh, all right, all right. I don't know if it's a question exactly, but I'm not comfortable with your using the word primitive for large groups of people. I would I would rather hear something like indigenous, first peoples, or something like that. There's something about the word primitive that implies that we are superior to them. My feeling is we have things that we can learn from those people too. I don't like, I don't know. Do you have any response to that?
Sure. Am I on now, Steve? Am I heard now? Okay. I absolutely agree with you. I was reading a quote when I used that word, and I came to it and I actually hesitated. I don't know if you could see it, because I too am uncomfortable with that word. It was a word used by Jung back in about 1915, and it was a word common to the era. Today we would speak of non-technological peoples or Aboriginal people or First Peoples or many other slogans. And that's the critique of the whole term primitivity, which Levi Bruhl, Levi Strauss, and others helped us sort of deconstruct and realize what we're doing is viewing a different form of intelligence, a different form of understanding, a different kind of sensibility, and a different set of symbolic values than ours, which were not primitive. They were often highly sophisticated and highly adapted to the world they had to live in. So I fully concur. So I won't plead guilty to using the word primitive, but I'll plead guilty to reading the word primitive tonight from a text that's a century old. So I appreciate the correction. Thank you.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask another question?
Go ahead, Ms. May.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, okay. All right. Do you think there are ever really truly ghosts that the deceased, those who have passed into spirit, visit us?
That's a great question.
It's
Question.
Yeah. Okay. That's the $64 question. Back when $64 meant something. I have an idea. We have to say throughout history, ghosts have been reported. Throughout our history, ghosts have been reported. I have to take those people seriously. I'm a complete agnostic on that subject. I was again relaying Jung's point of view, where he said many times, material disassociated from the ego will come to us as other. So if a person has a hallucination, for example, it's not unreal to them psychologically, it's profoundly real. And I would err to say, well, you didn't have that experience, or that wasn't real, because I'm ignoring their psychological reality. So when a person sees a ghost, is it a faulty perception? Is it a hallucination? Is it a projection? Is it disassociated material showing up, or is some disembodied spirit come back to confront them? And I remain agnostic on that subject. But again, that's why I said the haunting here is a metaphor for the fact that we live with the presence of many, many, many sort of historic entities that have a certain kind of psychic life within us. And that's as far as I want to push the metaphor.
Okay.
But thank you.
He did have visit mediums, and I think he had relatives who were mediums, right?
Unmuted.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Let me mute. Okay, there we go. That should be good. Gosh, thank you, Evanston. I really appreciate you joining us today. That was just nice to see your presence, and thank you for being brave and opening the webcam. I know it takes a little bit of courage sometimes. You don't know what kind of feedback and what will happen. We'll go ahead and sign off. I want to thank everybody today for participating, especially Dr. Hollis. I really, really appreciate your wonderful work, both in the written piece of work you've done with Hauntings and the marvelous soliloquy and just verbal abilities today. And in a difficult environment, it's not easy to talk for an hour straight to a webcam without seeing live people behind you. And I really want to thank you for your courage in so doing today.
Thank you, Steve.
For those on the webcast, you'll get a survey in a little bit. Feel free to give us some feedback about that. Keep in mind the upcoming seminars. I have quite a few coming up with that. I'll sign off in just a moment. Jim, any last thought, or we'll unmute your mic and we'll wind down in a second.
No, it's just that it's been a great privilege for me to have this opportunity to converse with each of you. And It's an invitation on Halloween Eve, as it were, to examine what presences are speaking to us, from whence they come, and if we can bring them into the realm of consciousness, we can have a lively debate, and frankly, your life gets even more and more interesting. So thank you very much.